Welcome everyone to day 3 of ARM Dev Summit. I'm delighted to be here with you today, talking about topics that affect the ARM ecosystem and how open source can help. My guests are Stormy Peters, Director of Microsoft's Open Source Program Office, Nuritzi Sanchez, Senior Program Manager at GitLab, and last but not least, Steve Geary, Director of Open Source at Wind River. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining me today. It'll come as no surprise to us here that open source is not new phenomenon. After all, Linux kernel has just celebrated its 30th anniversary. Stormy, would you like to kick us off and let us know how has Microsoft's mindset changed with regards to the impact of open source software?
Yeah, so it's probably no surprise to anyone that Microsoft has evolved in their approach and use of open source software over the years. I used to say at one point in time, Microsoft's first contribution to open source software was to be the common enemy, because I was at GNOME and the Microsoft Windows desktop was the enemy. But unknown to many people, Microsoft actually has been contributing to open source software for a long time. We were one of the largest contributors to the Linux kernel back in the early 2000s. So I think now if you look at it, Microsoft's mission is to help individuals and organizations achieve more. And we think through open source fits that really well. So we're really embraced helping our customers and our partners in the ecosystem achieve more and accomplish their goals by leveraging open source software in those goals.
Thanks, Stormy. Nuritzi, how have you seen developers change and how has their tooling changed?
Yeah, sure. So I think that I come into the open source, or did come into the open source world a little bit after the other panelists. So I've had this awesome opportunity to see changes even within a short amount of time. When I first started at GNOME, that's, I guess, the common thing that Stormy and I have, is that we were very developer centric. And I think that over the past few years, we've evolved to accepting other contribution methods and to having less patience for tooling that is not user-friendly, that is not as inclusive. And so I think that we are seeing open source software evolve even more so to fit the growing needs of a global audience and more users than ever before by inserting new contribution methods and contributors. So I think that that's a huge shift that I've noticed is kind of the focus on inclusivity and diversity. And I think that that's already beginning to benefit the entire open source ecosystem and shift the developer mindset into, creating something that is for everybody by including everybody.
Excellent, thanks, Nuritzi. Steve, has there been any change in the relationship between engineer and hardware, and how does open source influence that change?
Well, I think that's a great question, right? So that's always been a tough spot from a software development perspective, is their relationship with hardware. Right, hardware when you're a developer is a rare commodity most of the time. So I think what I've seen change here is from an open source perspective is developers finding ways to develop on various hardware by creating their own and sharing their own tools and actually contributing back. And I've seen these roll up into broader tool bases. If you're not in a corporate environment, maybe where you have access to hardware, you're going to be that stereotypic software developer in a basement in some remote part of the world. You're not going to have that same access, but yet you're going to want to contribute. So I think that open source and development tools shared among open source developers has really allowed for a broader contribution base to software development in the absence of ubiquitous access to hardware.
Thanks, Steve. Stormy, Microsoft has now grown a large portfolio of devices running on the ARM architecture. How does Microsoft see that engineer-hardware relationship evolve?
Yeah, so with the introduction of Internet of Things and cloud computing, there's a whole new area that we need to solve, like a whole new space for software solutions. So like just imagine now when you go into a store, when I pay with my credit card, my cell phone gets a text message that I paid with my credit card. So the data and the security is no longer just in that credit card payments hardware device. It actually has to go from that device to the cloud through probably multiple players, to my phone, and then back. And that introduces an opportunity, to develop solutions that span all of those architectures and all of those platforms. And so I think that's where, with the contributions that Microsoft's made and the different open source software projects that have been created and that have been donated to the Cloud Computing Consortia or to CNCF, it's all about making sure all of those players can develop solutions that work together and develop them in open source in a way that we can trust the solution, that hardware provider is happy that their data is being handled securely, that the data is being passed around in a way that respects that respects its security. And so I think that whole space is new. And I think it's really interesting and really fun to see how we can all work together on this. And I think it's important that it's open source for trust reasons, and also that it has an open governance model, that we're all working on these solutions together, and it's not any one player that's making the decisions. ARM and Microsoft Azure and the company that created the hardware device, all of these players are working together to create a secure solution, between the edge and the Internet of Things and the end consumer.
Thanks. Steve, as somebody that has to cat herd engineers on a daily basis, how do you see your engineers' relationship change with regards to the likes of developing for multiple devices but not actually having those devices to hand, so they're developing on the cloud? Is that something that is making life easier, or is it more complicated?
Well, so earlier I think it was Nuritzi that kind of introduced the generational view of this, right? And I think we're in my view into that is that we do kind of have a generational split, or at least a spectrum at this point in time. And those of us that grew up in a time when hardware was available to us are having to learn new tools, and those that are a bit newer to the world are more comfortable with the tools and are losing sight of getting what I like to call getting their fingernails greasy, and really understanding everything. And it kind of goes to Stormy's point as well, is that we've got some of the problems, or the old systems level engineer or developer doesn't have to worry about everything. They can be more specialized. They can worry about less. And I think the tooling and the day-to-day experience starts to represent that. It starts to show that, newer and newer tools aren't always better. Newer methodologies aren't always better all the way through the life cycle. And there's still a lot of grease that in lining up firmware, BSPs, hardware, operating systems. All that is still work that has to be done today, and it can be done with tools. And I've seen tools being developed, and I'm seeing day-to-day life being changed, so that the engineers on a day-to-day basis can actually really focus in, like Stormy said, on kind of what they're concerned about, not the entire development environment, not the entire the networking stack and the kernel. They can just worry about what they're supposed to do.
So effectively, more people become more specialized.
I think that's the case, right? And I think that really lends itself to an acceleration in innovation. We're not reinventing the wheel. Not everybody has to be, fully knowledgeable of everything. You want the breadth, but you don't need the depth everywhere that you had to. Individuals and groups can be more specialized. And I think it's really going to pay off and feed the innovation.
AI and machine learning is a hot topic across the industry. Nuritzi, how do you see this impacting software developers and their workflows, and are there any new and interesting ways that it's impacting them?
Yeah, so AI and machine learning are definitely on the rise. GitLab recently conducted a survey among its customers and found that over 75% were already using AI or machine learning. And so we realized that traditional versioning systems like Git weren't the best that are used in CI. Were not the best at handling, large data sets and models. And so part of what has been done recently by a team called iterative.ai is that they've created an open source version control system specifically for machine learning projects called continuous machine learning. So what this does is that it helps you put tables, data visualization, and sample outputs from models into comments directly into merge requests so that people can review those data sets and models just like they would code. And so the trend here is that, as more and more people use machine learning and AI, our developer tools need to adapt to help with that. Something that GitLab has also done is to use machine learning itself. First, we started off by creating a bot that automatically labels issues that people might submit. This was developed to help people be able to identify where their issue really lives and help get reviewers that can help review that specific issue. And I know that there are other developer tools being developed, like Microsoft's Copilot, that makes it easier than ever to code. And so there are in general lots of different ways that machine learning is being applied to help make developer and just general contributor lives easier. And so I'm really excited to see the trend towards this to help make all of our lives easier in creating great software.
Stormy, how should open source program officers handle the new trend?
So I think AI and ML is changing the world for all of us. Like, we're getting suggestions in real life on things. We're getting pointers to things we might find useful. Like, it's changing how all of us live today. From an open source perspective, it's introducing a bunch of new aspects. So when you talk about machine learning, you have the code, and then you have the models you might introduce, the models that get created, the data that you introduce. All of those have different aspects that may or may not fit under a traditional open source license, or they may have additional aspects like data privacy or data anonymity that you want to add to it. So I think OSPOs and companies and individuals are still figuring out how AI and ML changes the world and how we can best collaborate on them, which pieces are most important to collaborate on, most useful to collaborate on, and what that collaboration looks like. As an example, a couple of years ago, the Microsoft Teams team decided to open source the data sets that they use for background noises. So they have a whole bunch of background noise data sets that they use to test their calls on. So, if my dog barks in the background, maybe it won't play in our call because they've tested and been able to say, dogs don't normally participate in conference calls. Let's take that sound out. As an example, the most annoying sound people hear is candy wrappers, food wrappers. People hate those. So they decided to open source that data set, thinking it would be useful to other people also, doing video conferencing or trying to get rid of background noises. And it was a whole new conversation for us. So we spent a lot of time talking to attorneys and managers and trying to figure out, what does it mean to open source a data set? What license should it be under? Is it something people collaborate on? How do we make it useful for others? So I think AI and machine learning are changing our world for the better, and hopefully they'll do that in open source. They are doing that in open source. And I think it's up to us to help figure out how to best do that. How do we best introduce these new ways of working into open source? And does it mean new governance, new models, new security practices for the data? How do we handle that? So I think it's a really interesting space.
Excellent, thanks. Steve, automotive is growing in its adoption of open source. How are things like functional safety certifications and life critical security issues tackled within an open source software model?
Well, I think we have examples to look at, right? So even in just Wind River's been in that space for some time, and it's with Linux, and they're really, I'll be maybe politically incorrect here, but I'd say there's not a large community around, safety, or there at least historically hasn't been. And so, on the larger timeline, this is kind of an emerging thing, if you will. The software that goes into those cars is starting off, not necessarily completely in these highly critical areas, but over time it's going to move, just like open source does. It moves from a point that may not be the most critical, it may not be the most important, but it starts as a seed and it grows. So I think there's a lot of things that could be brought to bear in the terms of tools that will accelerate development cycles and assure compliance, or at least a good chance of being compliant with security and safety. But again, I think there's got to be a community with committed citizens around this to make it successful.
Thanks. Nuritsi, Internet of Things is a big topic. One of the big areas is security when it comes to IoT. So leaning into open source software and security, do you feel that security is better or worse with widespread adoption of open source software? And what are some of the interesting trends from a developer tooling perspective and engagement perspective that you're seeing when it comes to security?
Sure. So I think that that's a common misconception that I run into often among people who are not very familiar with open source. They think, oh, it's open to everybody, so anybody can insert malicious code, or, they somehow think that it'll be less secure. But having so many people working on your software and finding vulnerabilities and fixing them actively can help make your code even more secure. Instead of having a single, 10-person team, let's say you have maybe 100 people working on this, or, a just growing community around your software, making sure that it's safe. At GitLab, we get asked this a lot about, what kind of things we've implemented to help with security. And by having the single developer platform, we think that people who are committing code, you can get the security scanning there, so that you don't have to do a bunch of additional testing after the fact, after deploying, but you can do it right as you're developing it. I know there are lots of other tooling that is being created to, again, help with security. But I think that this is something that is becoming more and more of a focus in the larger technology world. And open source software is really leading in that regard.
Thanks, Nuritsi. Just briefly, Stormy, how do you see an OSPO's position when it comes to security?
Yeah, so as Nuritsi said, from the very beginning, open source software has positioned itself as more secure. I think it was Eric Raymond who said, many eyeballs makes software more secure. I'm getting the quote wrong. But basically, if a lot of people look at it, somebody's going to discover the problems. And open source software projects have adopted that within their framework. So there's usually somewhere you can report a security bug when you find it, before it's announced to the world, so the project has a chance to fix it for all of their users. But it's still open. Anyone can discover these, and anyone can report these. Some projects and some companies have offered bounties as well for people that find any issues and report them. And specifically, you asked about OSPOs. I think OSPOs are really important to make sure that we're considering those things, that when we open source things, or when we consume open source, that we know where it came from, we know what's in it, we know how we're using it, that we can, if there's an issue, we have 60,000 open source software components that we use in Microsoft. We have a record of everyone that's using them in every instance. It's millions of instances. And if there's a security incident, one of them, we need to be able to notify those people and say, hey, there's a problem here, and here's what you can do to fix it, or here you need to roll back, you need to update, you need to switch to something else. So I think the OSPOs play an important role in making sure companies are working with open source software in a way that keeps them and their customers and partners secure.
Excellent. Well, Thank you, Stormy. Thank you, Nuritsi. Thank you, Steve. So as you've heard today, open source is here to stay, and I invite you all to join in. And as always, in true open source fashion, patches are welcome. Thank you, and have a great rest of the ARM Dev Summit 2021.